Hello back, everyone. I hope you had some time to have coffee or tea, and we're back now. We're here for the next panel, and Aljoša Pužar is already here. Welcome. I will give you a short introduction, but before we also have another panelist, Mahret Ifeoma Kupka, who's with us digitally, and Aljoša will be the first one who will speak. Aljoša is a Croatian, Italian, Slovenian cultural studies scholar, an ethnographer and a writer and a social critic. He has taught literature theory, translation studies, cultural studies, gender studies, and cultural anthropology at several universities. So thanks for being here. I'm very excited to hear your talk.
Thanks. My talk will be without PowerPoint. I hope you don't mind. You're all visual people and oculocentric crowd. I hope that is not a problem. I will show you just one photo here that nobody will see, maybe camera. That is me as a child in 1981, the only kid attending opening of an exhibition and listening to something that I totally cannot understand. And on my t-shirt there is Big Boy in English. That was Yugoslavia 1981 for you. And that was me attempting to understand art. I'm an absolute outsider in your world, obviously, so I will talk as a type of ignorant spectator, more or less. When I was thinking about what to talk about and what to cover, I was starting with my fantasy of Habsburg Imperial Treasury in Vienna, in Hofburg, because when I think about institutions of contemporary art and institutions such as Biennale di Venezia and other such honorable institutions, I think of them in terms of treasury. And that is not, of course, accidental, and it is not accidental that imperial treasury suffered under Napoleon and under republics and under anything progressive that happened in the meantime. But they're still there. They're still there with little reliquia, with little golden crowns, with the crown of Holy Roman Empire or whatnot. And they're still keeping that for the pleasure of sensation seekers such as tourists. So the first idea I wanted to explore is the idea of the best that is still, of course, haunting the entire business that you are in and that maybe us as spectators are also in. The imperative of the best was, of course, amended with the imperative of being best in ethical terms. These two things are not only clashing, they're not naturally politically working together in ways that we imagined throughout our history of critical theory, cultural theory, Marxist, post-Marxist, and whatnot. Bandung, for instance, I was pleasantly surprised that you mentioned also that it is one of the myths that we are living in cultural studies, like Bandung Conference is one of those living myths that we are feeding on and feeding students to. So this is the first point of tension. It is the tension between best of the best and best of the good, to go back to Kostis, no? The second tension is the second point of tension is the imperative of novum. You know, in cultural theory, the novum, the imperative to do something new. You know better than I do, being art curators and art theoreticians, how important that is, and how much pressure we have on this vector of new and old in order to produce what we know is cognitive estrangement, that is to feel sufficiently surprised at what we are doing and what people around us are doing. So the new thing is an absolute pressure because we always need to be new, and we look back either in anger to break the floor of German pavilion in Venice, or with some kind of artificial nostalgia that is always, of course, contrived, reinvented. We work with trauma a lot, but often offer secondary traumatization through the process. There is a sense of fake in looking behind. If we would look behind with happiness, we would finish in bad place, in place for fantasy literature, in place of reactionary figures. Some Marxist art theory would reject our happiness as ultimately narrowly hedonistic and possibly reactionary. Temporality is, of course, very tricky substance of what we are all doing, because we are living in neo-medieval times. We have chiliastic, millenaristic, anti-vaccine, pro-vaccine, whatever masses screaming under our Bürgerlich windows, bourgeois windows. And obviously, there are some kind of community of spectators that we constantly address without ever really addressing them. So the second question that I'm asking is, how active is that community of spectators that is perennially neglected in what we are doing? I expect further pressures to that dimension, to dimension of novum, to dimension of best of the best and best of the good in anything curatorial. Another pressure that I wanted to mention more as a little seed for debate is, of course, pressure coming from what stupidly is called digitalization, but actually invention of worlds that are not entirely material in old-fashioned sense. I was recently reading about one interesting Viennese project, maybe you know it better than I do, that is DAD, Dust and Data, dealing with art curating in the era of artificial intelligence, and I'm sure that there are many similar projects around the world. And that is an important point of tension. That is how to do it in the era of not only artificial intelligence that is collecting and counting, but also curating in itself, and how to survive in the era where computers and machines are already assigned certain amount of meaning and certain amount of political agency, which is the most problematic. Because platform-based post-democracy and platform-based capitalism are engaging us with forms of post-democracy or post-politicality that will work very differently with our ideas of, I will make this biennale about migrants. I will make this biennale about, I'm not in charge anymore of that amount of data. That data is already beyond my political reach, even at some symbolic level. So we will absolutely need to remap, and I'm sure that many people are remapping this challenge. There are many positive and still after 20, 30 years after first wave of techno-utopians, we still have some techno-utopians that sound increasingly reactionary, like my friend Lev Manovic and others, who are predicting a quantitative cultural and art analysis that will partly replace our professional gaze, our knowledge of art and everything else. And what happened to me recently was that as an ethnographer in youth studies and whatever, I met a group of Croatian teens, and one of the things they did to me, trying to prove their positionality, as we would say, was to criticize my Instagram feed. They said, Professor, you might be whatever, smart people think like that for professors, which is ridiculous. But they say, your Instagram feed sucks. I said, why? I'm quite proud of my Instagram feed. Yeah, it looks a little bit 1990s, but they said, you suck with how you combine colors. I said, what do you mean combine colors? I'm posting photos of cities I visit. And they say, no, you need to combine blue with blue, pink with pink, red with red. I was puzzled. I knew that I've encountered some secret aesthetics that is already collective and deeply embedded in this community that I'm studying. I don't understand why blue needs to be with blue. That is against my whatever. But I was critical. I was thinking, okay, if Manovic predicts that we can extract aesthetics from lots of data, and he was telling me how in some countries Instagram is more bluish, in some countries Instagram is more pinkish, in some countries Instagram is more whitish. It's like Scandinavian design. I'm imagining Scandinavian Instagrams are more minimalistic than Italian Instagram. I'm bullshitting. But now I encounter at the ethnographic level this problem of collectivity, quantification, and connections between digital and material that we need to encounter. Then, of course, if we think about history of Venice, Biennale di Venezia from 1950s reform, then post-1968 protests, then 1970s reform, and all that revealed one tension that is very, how to say, conventional. That is a tension between open and closed, between inclusive and exclusive, between academic and young. And these are the same tensions that you would find in Paris Salon, in München Salon, and any other salons. So the structure of tension that you hear about in the history of Biennale, history of Documenta, history of Sao Paulo, and all that, are actually always that same structure that can be 19th century structure. It is not very different from bourgeois artistic salons of the fin de siècle or something like that. So the entire discourse, the entire debate, are biennales or biennial manifestations hegemonic or not? I find that debate strangely, not necessarily outdated, but out of place, or maybe, to follow what Kostis said, something is false about, something is, I see something fake, there is something fake about this counter-hegemonic move from some of those places. It is not very different from us in universities, from the crowd like me, typical Bürgerlich, pseudo-leftist cultural studies professor with the same amount of pseudo-counter-hegemonic movements that we perform, as Alia said very well, that we perform those movements every day. It is like Foucault's Fellowship of Discourses, and let's not go into good old Foucault. But all that is of lesser concern for spectators. Who are they? Where are they? How many of them can pay to travel to Venice? Those that pay and come to Venice are those people, the same people that we actually want to see there, to be very brutal about it. If in 2018 we had more than 300 relevant biennales, maybe 320, 30, 40, that produced a sort of tension saying, do we have too many biennales? And I saw many curators afraid of biennales, saying biennales are hegemonic machines, blah, blah, blah. But as we saw very well from Alia's talk, not every biennale is hegemonic machine. And not every biennale can escape the community in elegant bourgeois ways. Some biennales could in 1940s, 1950s, or even 1960s. What big biennales are telling us is that things do change, and not for them and there, but they do change in the global art scene, and fashions move from Paris to New York, from New York to Berlin, from Berlin probably to Seoul, South Korea, or something like that. I do think this century will be Asian. That is just a stupid phrase that keeps being repeated. Asia is not just Asia, as we know, so the phrase is politically incorrect and politically problematic in so many ways, but I do think that century will be Asian, probably East Asian for a start, due to the forces that are beyond anything curatorial and beyond anything actually that relates to artistic tastes. The brutality of soft power of the state, the soft power of corporations, along with global shifts in how capitalism works, will produce K-art as it was with K-pop. I expect that, even though art was lagging behind K-pop and Hallyu for a while. But with recent pressures on Hong Kong art market from the mainland China and possible movement of Hong Kong market to Seoul, as we read these days, we don't know if that will happen, but there is a possibility of K-art being promoted with very strong soft power by the state and corporations, and that will affect the entire world as we see it. For instance, Guangzhou Biennale is now going into, so for a long time I lived in Korea. That is why most of my experiences and comments are about Korea. I know I'm not Korean. I'm just married to a Korean. So I don't have positionality or political right to comment about it. But anyway, I will still do it, so you can criticize me later. So in Gwangju Biennale, there is this interesting situation that one superstar of South Korean curatorial practice, Kim Sang-jang, was recently called upon by the trade unions for whatever, unethical practices, whatever. And I'm not going into details to see who is right, who is wrong, because with this kind of story you can never know, and we shouldn't comment people that are not here. But what I find interesting is that Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter movement and transgender rights movement and environmentalist movements will change many curatorial games, even for those curators that always aesthetically and softly politically played by the rules or played by the book. There is a new tension, a new addition, affectively speaking, that many curators will need to deal with, even the most politically correct ones. Maybe I promise to talk about East Europe, because that is my localized knowledge. In 1949, I was born later, but in 1949, in my hometown, that is Rijeka, an art gallery was opened. And in 1951, one guy called Boris Vigentin, white guy, who was really old-fashioned white guy, but he didn't seem too toxic. We loved him. He became the chief of that gallery. In 37 years of his curatorial practice there, we had first salons, as we would. Europeans first would have salons. His salons were Yugoslav salons. He had a number of Yugoslav salons, collecting and curating art from newly joined republics. And there was this tension between social realism and brutalism and what was called regime art, and something that was neo-avant-garde and something that is in architecture elegant functionalism that we also used to have, and even very early and very clean postmodernism that was not as kitschy as one would think. So that was his world. That was his world that you cannot see in MoMA when we celebrate some reinvented Yugoslav past that needs to be brutalist, or in other words, to translate that into Kostis's, it needs to be barbarian or neo-barbarian. What is interesting is that in East Adriatic region, that same tension between westernized techno avant-garde movement and aesthetics and something that is considered barbarogenius or barbarogenius is an ongoing thing for almost 100 years. So when Marinetti is coming to promote his agenda, I cannot go into that, sorry, that is just my hobby. So anyway, when MoMA and others are promoting Yugoslav art and exoticize that art and our lives under communism and other people's democracies, what I'm thinking about is ex-U curatorial practice that is often self-orientalizing, that is often self-exoticizing, that is often doing these things like we are barbarians of whatever, but barbarians will bring solutions. There is a lot of bourgeois guilt packed into it, and a lot of not decolonized, not to say colonizing, but not decolonized curatorial practice with taking little photos and Instagram photos of partisan anti-fascist movement memorials. Marina Abramović famously did many such self-orientalizing gestures that went very well with American markets. Okay, back to Boris Vigentin. He installed lots of biennales, a number of biennales, biennales of young artists, Mediterranean Biennale, and there was a regularity of bringing foreign artists to Yugoslavia. That made sense. What happened with nationalist revival was to turn the vector on the other side. That is to start promoting the values of Croatian national art. So you have the same institution after he retired with very avant-garde and left-wing curators suddenly feeling that in order to prove that you are not colonized, that you are not bringing the best of the best from Berlin and München and whatever Croatians are usually doing, that you need to actually export your brand of pseudo-barbarism without recognition of aesthetic and historical hybridities that we more or less all share in certain social classes. So you have this performance of authenticity that is, of course, always coming with nationalist regimes and with crypto-nationalist curatorial practices. And that unfortunately happened. Fast forward to Slaven Tolj, very kind and nice, wacky curator from Lazaretti Galleries in Dubrovnik, who became a main figure of that same community of spectators that I belong to. You saw the picture that Mr. Boris Vigentin was curating for a long time. Suddenly, Slaven Tolj comes to this provincial city. He's seeing that something is wrong, that we have wrong measure of what is outside, what is inside, what is open, what is closed, what is localized knowledge, and what is cosmopolitan knowledge. And he decides to establish a new community of spectators, to break our little bürgerlich enjoyments, and to connect the gallery and museum in a way to completely merge it with so-called alternative scene, with bohemians, with homeless people. That is, he went into what is dream or wet dream or should be of cultural studies professors and progressive curators all around the world. He did that. What happened was a complete breakdown of spectatorship, complete breakdown of artistic community. Heritage was put at risk, much to the horror of bürgerlich heritage lovers. Rijeka became capital of culture, as you know, in 2020, for 2020. And one of the artistic actions was by the famous, now sadly dead Croatian artist, Ivan Kožarić, the recognized figure of a neo-avant-garde and various tendencies that went there. And he put a stack of hay, dry grass, stack of hay in the middle of city to provoke. For me, there was nothing really provoking about stack of hay because we are not as urban as to faint whenever we see hay. But many bourgeois critics saw themselves as urban enough to hate the hay. Okay, so the art worked, the artwork. What happened was that really homeless and really drunken and whatnot, artist/activist burned the hay. He came by the night and he burned the hay. Then, of course, you have the entire cycle. Suddenly, the bürgerlich scene feels sorry for the hay because hay was still art. Leftist progressives feel sorry because hay was showing middle finger to those bürgerlich ones, to the petit bourgeois ones. Suddenly, the main curator, that is Slaven Tolj, recognizes the act. And I was so happy, I actually publicly called him to recognize the act, not as a terrorist act towards art, as they started, but as a co-artistic practice, because this burning hay left one black mark around the hay on the asphalt, on the concrete of the city. So for me, it was co-curatorial or co-creative action. And Slaven Tolj absolutely accepted that in the end, which for me was quite promising. Of course, they crushed him, they sent him away, as they would with all good curators. How many minutes did I already crossed? I need to finish, sadly, yeah. I wanted to talk about Pyotr Davichenko's performance with eating live bats, and what that offers to our debate and curatorial practice in the time of Corona, and then about the pressures of techno-feudalism, as Varoufakis calls it, or the pressures of mass neo-medieval and retribalization in the sense of Umberto Eco's neo-medieval times, And then I wanted to say something about position of nation in all that as a unit that we count on in more than one way. Documenta in Athens, this and that. Never mind, skipping. Rohingya, Uyghur, hybridity as a burden and hybridity as a privilege.
I mean, maybe we can...
No, I don't want to hegemonize.
No, I mean, maybe you can add the points when we are back with the questions.
Okay.
I'm sure you can improvise and...
Okay.
Because, yeah.
And I wanted to say something about cultural appropriation, which I think is hugely problematic topic, and about finally solidarity, which is under pressure, as we see in European manifestations such as Manifesta and European City of Culture, that are always about solidarity, or usually with all this beautiful care, solidarity, friendship, and everything else, with lots of good actions, with very little long-lasting effects. Very little effect of Manifesta in Palermo, very little effect of European Capital of Culture in Maribor, with very little traces in real human life. And in the end, I wanted to say something about synchronizations, an affective approach to things, and the visceral aspect of empathy that might replace some of the vocabulary of empathy and care. I was thinking about working more in terms of mutual synchronizations or asynchronity rather than being obsessed with curatorial discourses on political correctness, care, and everything else. I think that is mostly what I wanted to talk about. Sorry for being so long. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Aljoša. Okay, so now we have the next speaker. I'm not sure because she's there? Yeah, okay. Hello. Hey. Yeah, so for our next, hey, it's nice that you're with us here today digitally. I'm not sure where to look, but yeah, I'll just introduce you. This is Mahret Ifeoma Kupka. She's an art scholar, a writer, a curator of fashion, body and the performative at the Museum für Angewandte Kunst in Frankfurt in Germany. And in her work she deals with issues of racism, memory, culture, representation and the decolonization of art and cultural practices in Europe and the African continent. Yeah, so now the stage is yours. Welcome again.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation, and I just followed Aljosha's lecture and especially what he was about to say in the end. I'm not going to talk about that precisely, but kind of. So it's going into a very similar direction. So I'm really looking forward to our discussion after my lecture. And yeah, unfortunately, I'm not there in person today. And so as the title of my lecture says, my work travels, I don't, for different reasons though than the ones I would like to talk about here today. At the same time, however, the fact that I could easily be traveling is also part of my lecture today, which necessarily includes a certain reflection on my own position in this field of the cosmopolitanism discourse, or more precisely Afropolitanism, which I would like to take a new look at today, or more precisely the critique of it and how this contributes to a reorientation or perhaps also a productive overcoming of the concept. And I do have a presentation which I'm going to share now. Okay, good. I just finished writing a text for the exhibition Catalogue of German Albanian artist Anna Ehrenstein's current exhibition in Linz, Austria. And her collaborative artwork, Tools for Conviviality, refers to a book of the same name by the social critic Ivan Illich. His work, published in 1973, is a critique of Western industrial society. In it, he doubts that technology makes people's lives easier. Instead, he thinks humans become slaves to machines. Ideally, people use tools to work with them rather than tools that work for them. And Ehrenstein adapts his critique to the technocratic and neo-colonial conditions that characterize our digital present by not inventing new tools, but trying to create something new with the existing ones. Her tools for conviviality are created in collaboration with Saliu Ba Donkafele, a fashion and artist collective, Nyanwati Gichao, Lydia Likibi, and Awa Sek. And while being somewhat organically growing, are a kind of answer to the question of conviviality. Ehrenstein marked a starting point. The idea and money came from her in Dakar in 2018. From then on, the project develops little by little from photographs, video, and textile sculptures. A spontaneous and open process in which everyone brings their respective ideas and skills, like fashion, photography, video work, yoga, criticism theory, and spiritual healing. And from which, in turn, everyone draws something for themselves and their own work. Ehrenstein did not want to approach the project with concrete plans and ideas, but to develop them on the spot together with all those involved. She was looking for a form of structured improvisation. The idea did not come from the desire for an African-European collaboration, as one might think, but a reflection on migration movements, her own German-Albanian one and that of her cooperation partners within the African continent, to and from Senegal, and related ideas of collaboration. Ehrenstein was born in Germany to Albanian parents. Her mother received a working visa. Her father had to leave Germany because his asylum application was rejected. This narrative fits into the image of migration that prevails in Europe and that we can see very recently at the Polish border. It shows a necropolitics, as Achille Mbembe calls it, that decides over life and death with the help of social and political power. Ehrenstein shares the experience of migration with her cooperation partners, although in a very different way. While her experience takes place between Germany and Albania, their migration experience relates to Senegal and thus to an intra-African migration movement that is hardly known in Europe, but which is actually much larger, more central and more significant from a global perspective. Statistics show that most Africans migrate within their own country as part of rural, urban migration or to other countries in the same region. There are many reasons for this, and these migratory movements have a long tradition. There's actually an exhibition on show right now in Paris at Cadiz, Diaspora at Home, which is a collaboration with the CCA in Lagos. And the exhibition was there shown in 2019. And due to the corona pandemic, it is on show in Paris just now, which is just a side note and for you to maybe check out later if you're interested. A quote by Mbembe from his 2007 text, Afropolitanism, fits into this context. The cultural history of the continent can hardly be understood outside a paradigm of itinerancy, mobility, and displacement. our way of belonging to the world, of being in the world, and of inhabiting the world has always been marked, if not by cultural mixing, then at least by the interweaving of worlds. Ultimately, it was colonialism and the associated violent creation of nation states with its borders by European colonizers that largely brought cultural and also collaborative movements on the African continent to a standstill or called for creative solutions. Quote, that interweaving is a slow and sometimes incoherent dance with forms and signs which we have not been able to choose freely, but which we have succeeded as best we can in domesticating and putting at our disposal. This is a view that goes against national borders and the cultural essentialism associated with them. Mbembe goes so far as to de-essentialize the concept of being African and to understand it as inclusive, thereby also including African realities such as those of Southeast Asian immigrants and white Africans in his concept. The Afropolitanism that Mbembe describes is different from other definitions. His text was published 2 years after Haile Selassie's essay, Bye Bye Baba, or What is an Afropolitan?, in which she draws from her personal experience of felt homelessness to create a term for a specific way of being in the world that has been widely criticized for its focus on a privileged group of people of African descent who, through passport privilege or monetary means, can live a life of being at home everywhere and nowhere at the same time, unlike those who don't have that choice. With the next picture, I'm trying to do some kind of like self-reflection. These are 2 photographs taken 2019 at the Circle Art Gallery in Nairobi. It shows like me and some friends posing in an art installation by Nigerian artist Dennis Osabede. And while like the boys on the right are mostly artists from Kenya, like me and my friend being of like African American and Kenyan and German and Nigerian descent, and we kind of also fit into this picture of being African or being also Afropolitan in the world, like this mixing up of the diasporic being in the world and also still being linked to the African continent. And then there's this quote. So I can see it now. But yeah, you can see it. There's like this critique of Emma Dabiri, also like criticizing this idea, this concept of Afropolitanism. From here, I would like to take a closer look on art. And this photo shows Sylvester Okwonode Ogbechi giving a lecture at the HKW in 2018, like Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin, about Karl Einstein and his approach to African artifacts and seeing them as actual artifacts, like as artwork. And Ogbechi was one of the first to flag the problematics of Afropolitan art. In 2008, he argued that the term supported a bias that only views African artists working in the West as relevant, while the artists living and working on the continent are largely ignored. Despite the international lifestyle enjoyed by the Afropolitan defined by Selassie, most Africans have almost absolute immobility on a contemporary global world that works very hard to keep Africans in their place on the African continent. He points out there's no immigration policy anywhere in the West world that welcomes Africans, and a major bias against African global mobility abounds in international media. Most African-based artists would find it difficult, if not impossible, to get a visa to visit Western museums or to show their work abroad. Although this is a fact, I think it falls short and can no longer fully reflect current realities. What Dabiri rightly criticizes is an Afropolitanism that tries to implement Western ideas in order to set a positive, successful image against Afro-pessimist stereotypes. But what about an Afropolitanism that doesn't even try to do that anymore, but rather makes use of skills acquired in the world and privileges gained on the African continent, not only to show the image of a supposedly rising continent, but to contribute to one that is actually rising. Dabiri's concern is that an uncontested version of Afropolitanism becomes the single story of Africa. But who is telling the story to whom? Shouldn't it rather be about dissolving the hierarchizing configurations of tellers and listeners altogether? The single story no longer poses a threat in an environment where the idea of relevant and non-relevant stories is dismissed altogether. The success story of Ghanaian painter Amoako Boafo may still fit into the picture book aesthetics of commodified of Afropolitanism. On the left side, we see a cover of the September issue of German art magazine Monopol, which was about the hype of African art, which is prevailing for quite some time now, but Monopol dedicated that issue to that specific topic. And on the right, we see a collaboration Amoako Boafo did with the Dior Men for Spring-Summer 2021, where he used partly like prints of some of his artworks on the clothes and was involved in the design of the collection. Boafo is currently probably the most financially successful, or at least one of the African artists. He studied in Vienna, among other places, and says he is influenced by Egon Schiele, which definitely makes his works connectable to Western art history. In general, the subject of figurative painting is a very big one. It cannot be, as I would argue, separated from the long and violent history of the objectification of Black bodies in Europe and the Americas. This is precisely where the need for constructive criticism becomes visible, which still exists far too little. It must be discussed to what extent the interest in figurative painting from the African continent is linked to a wide gaze. In addition, of course, there is the aspect of empowerment, which Boafo also clearly names, the self-inscription in the history of art. But what kind of history is this into which one inscribes oneself? One that had no place for one from the beginning. Is that even possible? I would like to doubt that. Ibrahim Mahama deliberately withdraws from the art centers of the world, and I would definitely call Accra an upcoming center as well, and sets up an art center in his community of origin in order to teach not only art as a craft, but above all its theory in order to stimulate new learning. Perhaps it is not so much a matter of learning something, but first of all of unlearning. The literalist scholar Walter Mignolo developed his concept of epistemic disobedience in 2006. This is directed against Occidental thinking as a formation of power and knowledge relations. The call for disobedience is a call for resistance against the manifold forms of epistemic violence through which knowledge and research practices are placed in the context of relations of power and dominance. This resistance is not to be thought of as a counter, but rather as a practice that goes beyond binary thinking and implies a so-called delinking, not only from Western thought structures, but from the categories and binary oppositions that have been imposed on other cultures as characteristic structures of the epistemology of Western modernity. Central to this is Mignolo's idea of border thinking, which states that thinking and knowledge do not stop at national and cultural borders, but should, or rather must, establish connections between different cultures and nations. Mignolo, like Mbembe, refers to the madeness of borders created from the perspective of European colonial expansion. For him, the border is an epistemic metaphor, geographical, political, and subjective, that must be crossed through dialogue on an equal footing and at eye level. Resistance takes the form of a conscious crossing of borders between epistemes and an exchange of knowledge in both directions. I'm coming back to Ehrenstein's work. Ehrenstein does not identify as white because of the historical racialization of Albanians in Europe, reinforced by prevailing forms of anti-Muslim racism. Yet we are privileged by our proximity to whiteness and power, she says. It is always a question of relation and a responsibility as those anchored in Western knowledge systems and institutions to think about one's own privileged position, which is always also part of the modern colonial system. As soon as thinking and position is recognized as locatable, it also loses its universal claim and must always reacquire validity and legitimacy in specific contexts. And it is precisely this that needs to be considered as a creative source, because it is in this process of legitimization that encounter and relationship become possible, and that is much more difficult than it seems. The famous quote by Audre Lorde. And according to Audre Lorde, the master's tool will never dismantle the master's house. The logical consequence of this would be that other tools are simply used, but where do they come from if we have to assume that we probably always already find ourselves in the master's house, and that the master does not only live in the institutions and on the street, but also in us and our relationships, as art mediator and curator Nora Sternfeld assumes, meaning that being and acting outside of traditional power structures and categories is inconceivable, because even our thinking is permeated by them, and every supposedly new creation only reproduces these categories. So how can we think structures if we ourselves are structures? A first step may be to accept chaos, a second to reflect on ourselves and our relationships to each other, and on the recognition of the simultaneity of process and moment. For thinking must change in the process of thinking, or action changes in the process of action. There is no clear starting point. There is no clear path to follow, except perhaps that of learning from each other, which can happen in a collective process, as exemplified by Ehrenstein's tools for conviviality, as a radical possibility of collective unlearning. Unlearning of boundaries, borders, dominant narratives, and centers in order to create a free society based on relationships. Maybe at some point the artist doesn't want to travel anymore. In 1977, Nigeria hosted the second World Black and African Festival of Arts and Cultures called Festag 77. That's an international pan-African festival held on the continent once a decade to celebrate African heritage in the post-colonial period. And festival organizers chose the Queen Idia mask, which is shown here, to be the emblem of the festival and made an official request to the British Museum for the return of the mask. And the British Museum refused, based on concerns about the safety and security of the mask, which sparked outrage in Nigeria and across the diaspora. The British Museum then made a replica of the original mask to appease the Nigerians, but this one was rejected by the festival organizers and therefore never sent to Nigeria. Instead, the Festag 77 organizers created their own replica of the Queen Mother's mask, which went on view at the festival and was lauded as just as artistically impressive, if not more so, than the original. As a testament to the generational nature of craft work in Benin, the artist who sculptured the replica was a descendant of the artist who created the original mask. This made me think about what a future might look like in which Africa would lose its interest in Europe, in which the objects would no longer be reclaimed because their spiritual energy could be made to flow again through new objects. COVID pandemic restrictions encouraged reflections on how we can and want to meet. This June, I co-organized a performative conference in Berlin and Nairobi called Unexpected Lessons. It took place in both cities at the same time. Made necessary or possible even by COVID, we decentralized the festival's hub. We were turning to our co-hosts in Kenya and took part in their debates rather than inviting them to take part in ours. Decentralization also makes traveling south-north less desirable. We are yet to find solutions to restrict climate-killing traveling and the danger of provincialization and new forms of essentialism. But maybe not today, or maybe in the following discussion. Let's see, I'm curious, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Mahret. Aljoša, can you please come back again? So yeah, those were two really interesting talks. I'm trying to find ways to connecting them, but my first question actually goes to you, Mahret, because you mentioned the diasporas with passport privileges, and one question I have is, how do you see the role of diasporas, it could be also Asian diasporas or African diasporas with passport privileges within the art world? You talked about like this kind of synthesis or maybe this interweaving worlds of different migrations. So is there maybe a potential wider space for those people with passport privileges to act and practice solidarity as a verb, as like actually doing something? So this is the question.
Yeah, I think maybe that's coming with like passport privileges. I think also like a question of privilege altogether. So I tend to not see privilege as a negative thing. It has like always this weird connotation to it that one should be like ashamed of having a privilege or something, or needs to reflect this. But of course, I find it very important that one really reflects on the privileges and then in the next step thinks about the possibilities on how to use them to create change or be part of change and to open doors probably. So I do have passport privilege. like being born and grown up in Germany with a German passport, and then also having also a West African passport, which makes it like, which kind of like opens up endless possibilities of easily traveling without having to apply for visa, and being afraid of getting that visa application denied. So I think there is this kind of responsibility, at least I feel it for myself, and to use that privilege and to make whatever is possible that comes with that privilege.
Thank you. I don't know if you have...
Can I comment?
Yeah, of course, please. Yeah.
Just a small anecdote, since I decided that my speech will not be theoretical today. When I was waiting as a Croatian citizen right after the Croatian War to start working as a professor in Italy, and I was waiting in police station surrounded by mostly African people and Albanians. I was the only burgerlich, proto-hipsterish bourgeois person in the entire room, and at that point I didn't feel I need to feel guilty. I didn't know anything about it, so I was completely ignorant. That was 25 years ago. And then we started to give fingerprints, first fingers and palms, and then this. And this part surprised me. I didn't know that that exists. And then I was so confused that I didn't know where to press and everything. And then policeman smiled to me. She didn't smile much to anyone else in that room. She smiled to me, looking at my documents, and said, "It's okay, professor, you know, we need to do it." So class, absolute class, is something that we tend to neglect. Even post-Marxists neglect class. Even I believe, I cannot speak for other races or nations, but I can speak for Balkans. Class is everything. Class is cosmopolitan. Class is national or a-national, depending on the situation. So privilege is coming with a capitalist package and with financial benefits and with credit levels and all that. And it tends to be forgotten in our folklore, almost folkloristic talk about ethnicities and identities and authenticities, that actually class really matters in all those things.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely. In Germany also, I would say in lots of discussions it's left out, and it's a huge part, of course. So my next question goes to you, or maybe both of you. First, maybe Aljoša. So yeah, as an art mediator, I said before, I'm trying to be quite practical, talking to people, doing workshops and so on. And so when we have this language of solidarity and care and so on, I wonder what it actually means. We talked about this notion of care or solidarity as a verb, as actually doing something. So my question to you is, how do you translate solidarity into action personally?
Yes, by being an activist and all that, that is all this outdated form of being political in this world. I'm more and more attracted, as I said before, to something that might be the affective content of that. The fact that the entire room in that Italian police station was afraid, and that I was not afraid, just confused. There was one nuance in between afraid and confused. I was confused and comforted by the system. They were afraid and not comforted by the system. And 20 years ago or 25 years ago, I couldn't notice that nuance. I was thinking at that point that I'm in the same situation like people that were scared around me, which is almost unbelievable if I think about it now. Not to go into bourgeois guilt trip or anything, it is just unbelievable cognitively, epistemologically, and ultimately politically. So I would say you need to be viscerally open to feel scared if everyone around you is scared, which is tricky, which can be politically manipulated for bad things, and that happens with fear and with other things. And we are searching a type of affective independence while trying to overcome neoliberal individuality and responsibilization of life. So how to connect that? very hard. You need to relax. Everyone need to relax. What was that politics of yoga? What was that? There is a kind of visceral work that needs to be done with proximities, with touch, with haptics, with just being with each other in the same places, with eating, with sleeping in the same places. That is, with breathing the same oxygen. I know it's pathetic. It's almost like some kind of strange discourse that Kostis would hate. But there is something about affective synchronization, I would say, that is perennially neglected. We are all about talking to each other, being dialogical, I don't know what. I think all that is failed because language, as you said structure is already colonial, and language of the structure is colonial, and it will remain colonial, unfortunately, for a long time.
Yeah, I completely agree. And but because I also think that solidarity also comes with like kind of empathy, and sometimes it's kind of limited because solidarity also means being in solidarity with others who you can't really relate to because their life situation and reality is completely different to yours in some way, but still like kind of finding ways and spots on how to connect nevertheless. And so I would also completely agree that there is this whole like sensual aspect that is, I think there are things changing in also curatorial practices and works, but it has still some kind of negative connotation to it still, that it's, yeah, that like getting like in contact, not only like over like talking, but also about like feeling like the sensual element also is a very crucial part to solidarity.
Yeah, actually, for researching, I thought I'd just check solidarity on Wikipedia, the classic move, and I thought it's interesting. On a German Wikipedia page, it said solidarity is the opposite of competition. I thought that was quite interesting. And now I'm trying to connect this to, you were also talking about this structure of tension and about accessibilities, inaccessibilities, and connecting this to this visceral feeling. Also from my mediation perspective, it is very essential that you are actually aware of how bodies enter those spaces, because they are, like Sarah Ahmed mentions, those atmospheric walls, yeah. That also thinking of class, for example, who goes to a museum, who goes to an art institution, who feels comfortable. I mean, I worked there for a while now and I still don't feel comfortable as a racialized person. And those are lots of things that are kind of hidden, and then there's this caring language and so on that also obscures these things sometimes even more, which is absolutely absurd, right? I mean, absolutely. Yeah. I'm looking at the time. How much time do we? Okay. So, are there questions from the audience or maybe online? Nope. So let's check my my other questions. Just give me a second. I have like way too many notes. I was thinking of that one question I also asked to Kostis about care. Let me just find it. Yeah. So the question was, we can use solidarity as well. So what does solidarity look like in a position of power, like an art institution, and what does solidarity look like when you are not in a position of power? It's very wide, but maybe you can associate some things or pick a point.
I don't know.
But maybe I can say something about like the position of power, because like I'm working in an arts institution, so to some extent I have power, like only out of the fact that I'm there and in an unlimited position, which gives me kind of power, some kind of power. And I think it's some form of solidarity is also to be able to give up space, to kind of like to use the power to open up space and to hand over the mic in a way, so that others can be able to also like enter the space and maybe do something with it that is not that can't be really expected, so that without having like an agenda, just to be open to say like, okay, I'm giving up the space, and so you can do with it whatever you want, and I'm fine with it, and I'm like open to just be part of that process, and without really having to intervene all the time. So this might be like a form of practicing solidarity from a power perspective.
As a professor, can I say, already maybe fourth time I decided to sacrifice my comfort and privilege for the sake of disempowering the classroom, which would not go, disempowering me in the classroom, which didn't go so well with many of my employers. So I hope University of Ljubljana people are not here or online. I suppose they're not. So following the anarchist practice, I almost cancelled all grading, which is sort of illegal. So I'm at the sort of edge of legality there, but trying to recreate pedagogical process into communal process with all the diverse problems coming from boys always talking first in patriarchy, or racialized people feeling racial. You know what I mean? There's the whole spiral. So all that included in this pedagogical process seen as communal, that is probably my main form of activism that nobody notices. Everyone notices if I'm fighting with some city mayor, and then they think that is politics. No, politics is something completely different. Politics happens intimately, very, very intimately, especially in situations that are structurally, as you said, structurally created as disciplinary and as spaces of a visible privilege. So that would be one of the answers.
Yeah, it also makes me think of Bell Hooks' teaching pedagogy. I forgot the title, but yeah, because those are all learning spaces, like the... Paolo. Yeah. Yeah, exactly, something like this, but also the... yeah, so you said that it's important to give also spaces and to other people, but also maybe leaving your authority a little bit behind. That's how I understood it, right? Which is, yeah. And then we also talked about those atmospheric walls, the structure tension, and of course...
Unlearning through learning from disempowered.
Yeah. And of course, in a classroom, you know, you enter, you're there as an authority, the pupils are there. There are those atmospheric walls, and it's hard to, maybe it's not possible to really break them down, but I think there can still be a caring atmosphere, but maybe we also have to acknowledge this toxicity that is...
But caring atmosphere is very tricky, because you finish in Kostis's problem. So you rather do something else. You scream, you put the sound of the rain and thunders. Thunders scare all of us. Even me, I put the file of thunder and I'm still scared, even though I'm old, fat, bourgeois, safe person. So thunder is something that scares us all. So if I start my class with thunder, I know we are together at least for a second, and that might be enough for the next step. So you never start with talking about care and how we are caring. That is disgusting. That is almost fascist.
No, I think I know what you mean. I meant this thing of caring in a sense of that there's, and that's another buzzword, but care and conflict, that there's also space that we can have debates and, like, you know, maybe get a little bit angry and so on. Also, it's important. Yeah, thank you so much. Do you have any other remarks or comments, maybe also about the things we heard before?
Thank you.
No. Okay, then, yeah, thanks for being here digitally, and we'll have a short break, and then we'll have the last panel. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.